The breech sat on a canvas sheet in a hangar at Boscombe Down, still warm from the crate it had travelled in from Tunis. It was a cylinder of dark steel, 88 centimetres long, cut open along its axis so the working parts lay exposed like a body on a table. Wing Commander Alan Hartley of the Aeroplane and Armament Experimental Establishment had seen German ordnance before. Recovered fuses, cracked gun barrels pulled from crashed Stukas, the usual scrap that came through in 1943. This was not scrap. Someone had sectioned the barrel of a Rheinmetall Borsig Mk-103, a 30mm autocannon pulled from the nose of a captured Henschel HS-129. And what Hartley found inside the bore stopped him before he had even picked up a torch. The chrome lining down the barrel's throat was unmarked. No pitting, no wear rings, no scoring from the thousands of rounds the weapon's service log said it had fired. It looked, in his own words written that afternoon, as though it had come from a factory that did not yet exist. What his team would find over the next 6 hours would force the Ministry of Aircraft Production to rewrite its assumptions about how long a British tank-busting gun could survive a single sortie. The HS-129 itself had come down largely intact near Mejez El Bab in April, its pilot dead at the controls, the aircraft's belly armour scorched but unbroken. It was an ugly machine, a stub-nosed, heavily armoured ground attack aircraft the Luftwaffe had built for one purpose, killing Soviet armour on the Eastern Front, and a handful had been rushed to North Africa to do the same to Allied tanks. What made this particular wreck valuable wasn't the airframe, it was the gun. The HS-129B2/R3 variant carried the Mk-103, a cannon so powerful its designers had needed to mount it externally in a ventral pod, because the recoil would have cracked the aircraft's own fuselage frames if fired from within. British intelligence had reports on the weapon's paper specifications for over a year. They had never had one to cut open. Before Hartley's team went further, it's worth pausing on why this mattered in April 1943. 8th Army tank crews at that exact moment were reporting German aircraft that could open a Sherman's turret roof from 400 meters in a single pass without needing a bomb. Men were dying to a gun the Allies had only ever seen fire from a distance. Understanding what was inside that cylinder wasn't an academic exercise for men in white coats. It was the difference between a crew answering a question and a crew still guessing by Christmas. If you're the kind of person who wants the wartime engineering nobody put in the textbooks, the numbers stamped on the metal, not the numbers in the press release, this channel exists for exactly that reason. A subscription costs you nothing, and it tells us to keep pulling reports like this one out of the archive boxes where they've sat for 80 years. Now, back to the bore. The first thing Hartley's fitter did was weigh the barrel assembly on the hangar scale. 31 kilograms for the barrel alone, nearly double what a British 20mm Hispano weighed complete. He logged it, then moved to the chamber, where he found something that made him call over the establishment's senior armament officer, Squadron Leader Reeve. The chamber walls showed a hard chrome plating nearly 1/4 of a millimetre thick, applied not just to the throat, where British and American guns of the period sometimes chromed the first few inches to fight erosion, but the full length of the bore, muzzle to breech. Reeve ran a fingernail down the lining and found no seam, no variation in thickness he could detect by feel. In his written report, he used 4 words that AAEE staff would repeat to each other for months afterward. This is not improvised. The implication was simple and uncomfortable. German industry, under Allied bombing, blockade, and a war on 2 fronts, had the metallurgical capacity to full chrome line a high-velocity cannon barrel as standard production, not as an experimental luxury. If a gun's bore didn't erode, it didn't lose muzzle velocity, it didn't lose accuracy, and it didn't need replacing every few hundred rounds the way early war Allied cannon often did. Reeve set his tea down on the workbench that morning and didn't pick it up again for 40 minutes. One of the fitters, a young man named Corporal Fenn, later told colleagues he'd never seen an officer stand that still over a piece of metal. It is the kind of detail that doesn't make it into the official minute, but it tells you what the room felt like. The second layer of the examination went to the ammunition feed, and this was where the maths turned frightening. The Mk-103 fired a 30mm round at a muzzle velocity of roughly 860 meters per second. For comparison, the German Mk-108 cannon fitted to many Luftwaffe fighters fired a similar caliber round at barely 500 meters per second. A weapon so slow that pilots had to fly dangerously close to their targets to guarantee a hit. The Mk-103's higher velocity meant a flatter trajectory, less lead required, and a hit probability at range that British gunnery instructors hadn't planned their tactics around. Hartley's team clocked the cyclic rate at approximately 420 rounds per minute, using the recovered gas-operated mechanism, slower than a machine gun. But each round carried a projectile weighing around 330 grams, filled with either high explosive or, in the armor-piercing variant, a tungsten carbide core designed specifically to punch through the roof armor of a tank turret, exactly where crews least expected an attack from above. It was while measuring the recoil buffer assembly that Reeve made the connection nobody in the hangar had said aloud yet. He pulled the operating manual translation off the bench, cross-referenced the muzzle energy figures, and turned to Hartley. "This wasn't built to kill infantry," he said. "This was built to kill Shermans and T-34s from an aircraft in one pass and go home to do it again tomorrow." The gun's entire design philosophy, the chrome bore that wouldn't degrade, the buffer system that let it survive its own recoil mounted rigidly to an airframe, the round chosen specifically for armor defeat rather than general destruction, pointed to a weapon built for sustained anti-tank operations at a tempo the Allies had not accounted for in their loss projections. 200 miles from that hangar, at that same hour, the fighting around Tunis was entering its final weeks, with Allied armoured units pushing through country where HS-129s had already been active against them for months. The men writing home that week didn't know a barrel from their own wrecked tank was on a bench in Wiltshire being measured to the millimetre. They only knew the aircraft that hit them came in low, fast, and didn't seem to miss as often as it should have. The third layer came from the barrel's rifling itself. A AAEE's metallurgist, examining a cut cross-section under magnification, found that the chrome plating followed the rifling grooves with almost no variation in thickness around the bore's circumference. A manufacturing tolerance that, in 1943 British production, would have been considered aspirational for a peacetime factory, let alone one operating under sustained bombing raids on its supply chain. He measured the plating at 0.22 to 0.24 millimeters throughout, a spread of just 0.02 of a millimeter across the entire barrel length. British Ordnance Board figures from the same year, when applying partial chrome lining to 20mm cannon, routinely accepted variances more than double that. Someone in Rheinmetall-Borsig's production chain had solved a plating uniformity problem that British industry hadn't fully cracked. The metallurgist's note, later filed with the report, read simply, "Recommend immediate liaison with Vickers Armstrong's bore chrome process. Sample attached." The fourth layer, and the one that turned the report from a curiosity into a priority document, came when Hartley's team ran the numbers on barrel life, using erosion rate calculations standard to the Ordnance Board. a conventional unchromed 30mm bore firing the Mk-103's propellant charge would show measurable accuracy loss inside 500 to 600 rounds fired. The chromed bore in front of them, according to the unit's own maintenance log recovered with the aircraft, had fired in excess of 2,200 rounds with no barrel change recorded. That was not an incremental improvement. That was a weapon that could fly 4 times as many sorties before needing a barrel replacement that, on the ground, in North Africa, with parts shortages on both sides, could keep an aircraft grounded for days. Hartley wrote to the Ministry of Aircraft Production that same week, and the phrase he used, "an unacceptable disparity in weapon endurance," is preserved in the file at Kew. Corporal Fenn, cleaning his hands with a rag at the end of that session, asked Reeve a question that the squadron leader repeated for years afterward at dinners. "Sir, if theirs doesn't wear out, what happens to ours?" Nobody in the hangar had an answer that afternoon. Here is what the examination came down to. Once every measurement was on paper. Britain's frontline anti-tank aircraft, the Hurricane WWII, with its 40mm Vickers-S guns, and even the newer cannon fitted to Typhoons entering service that year, used barrels that eroded within a few hundred rounds of sustained firing, because full-bore chrome lining at that level of manufacturing precision was not yet standard in British production. The Germans had solved it, quietly. Inside a gun nobody in London had been able to examine until a dead pilot's aircraft came down largely intact outside Majez El Bab. The consequence moved fast for wartime bureaucracy. Within 8 weeks of Hartley's report reaching the ministry, Vickers Armstrongs and the Royal Small Arms Factory at Enfield had been instructed to prioritise chrome bore lining research on the 40mm S gun and on developing cannon programs, using the captured barrel's cross-sections as reference material. It did not happen overnight, and British full-bore chrome lining wouldn't reach the same tolerances Reeve had measured until well into 1944. But the direction changed. Aircrew flying tank-busting sorties over Normandy a year later were flying guns with longer service lives specifically because of what one squadron leader found at the bottom of a cold cup of tea in a Wiltshire hangar. That barrel section still exists. It sits, largely unremarked, in a small ordnance collection connected to the RAF Museum's reserve holdings. A cut cylinder of grey steel with a bore lining that, 80 years on, has barely discoloured. Visitors who glance at it read a small card describing it as a captured German aircraft cannon component, 30mm Second World War. Almost none of them know that this single piece of metal quietly told the British aircraft industry that its own guns were wearing out 4 times faster than the enemy's, or that the 2 men who first opened it stood in a hangar in silence because they understood, before anyone else in the country did, that the war in the air over a tank battlefield was going to be decided by something as unglamorous as how well a piece of chromium adhered to the inside of a gun barrel, and that for the better part of a year it hadn't been decided in Britain's favour.